My daughter was standing beside me when the woman who gave birth to her pointed across the conference table and said, "She is not your real mother. She is just a lonely woman who wasted 10 years raising someone else's child." 10 years earlier, that same woman had left a 6-year-old girl sobbing on courthouse steps with one blue backpack and said, "We'll find her another family." Now, a company wanted to buy my daughter's app for $32 million, and both of her biological parents had returned to claim a share. They had documents, lawyers, and a story designed to erase everything I had done. What they did not know was that the child they abandoned had finally decided to speak. Before I take you back to the afternoon that changed both our lives, I hope you are doing well today. Stay with me to hear what happened, and please subscribe to the channel if you believe family is defined by who stays when everyone else walks away. It began on a cold afternoon in late November of 2016, outside a family courthouse in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. My stepsister Melissa had asked me to attend her final divorce hearing because she said she needed someone on her side. Melissa and I had lived under the same roof since I was 14, when my father married her mother. We had never shared blood, but for years I had defended her as if we did. That afternoon I was 36, and still accustomed to cleaning up whatever Melissa left behind. The hearing had lasted nearly 3 hours. Melissa and her husband, Grant, argued over the house, 2 vehicles, a retirement account, and even the dining room furniture. At one point, they spent almost 20 minutes fighting over a boat neither of them had used in 2 years. Their 6-year-old daughter was mentioned only when the judge asked about custody. Neither of them gave a direct answer. When the courtroom doors finally opened, Melissa walked out first, gripping a folder against her chest. Grant followed with his attorney. Both looked angry, but neither looked heartbroken. Avery sat on a wooden bench against the hallway wall. Her feet did not reach the floor. A blue backpack rested between her shoes, so full that its zipper strained around the edges. She held both straps in her fists and watched every adult who passed, as though she was waiting for someone to tell her where she belonged. I sat beside her. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" She nodded too quickly. "Mom said we're almost done." I looked toward Melissa, who was standing near the courthouse entrance with Richard, the man she planned to marry. He wore an expensive wool coat and kept glancing at his watch. Grant's new wife, Celeste, waited several yards away, with her arms folded. The two couples had positioned themselves on opposite sides of the lobby, but the expressions on Richard's and Celeste's faces were nearly identical. Neither wanted Avery moving toward them. Melissa gestured for me to come closer. "Can you keep her tonight?" she whispered. "Tonight? Richard and I need to talk. Things got complicated in there." I looked at Avery. "Where is she supposed to go after tonight?" Melissa rubbed her temple. "I don't know yet." Grant overheard us and stepped closer. "Don't look at me. My new wife won't take her." Celeste's mouth tightened, but she did not deny it. I stared at him. "She is your daughter." "I know who she is," he snapped. "But Celeste and I agreed we were starting fresh. There isn't even a room ready for her." Melissa gave a bitter laugh. "As if Richard has a room waiting." Richard finally looked up from his phone. "We discussed this, Melissa. Your divorce was supposed to resolve the custody issue before the wedding." "She's 6, I said. "She is not an issue to be resolved." Richard looked away. Melissa lowered her voice, but Avery was close enough to hear every word. "Neither will my husband," she said. "We'll find her another family." For a moment, I thought the sentence had come out uglier than she intended. People sometimes said cruel things when they were angry. I expected Melissa to look at her daughter, regret it, and take the words back. Instead, she pulled on her gloves. Grant adjusted his coat and headed for the doors. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To my car." "And Avery?" He glanced at the small girl on the bench, as if he had only just remembered she was there. "Melissa asked you to take her. For one night. That's between you and Melissa." He pushed through the courthouse doors. Celeste followed without looking back. Melissa turned toward Richard. I caught her arm. You cannot both leave. She pulled free. I said it's temporary. How temporary? A few days. Where will you be? At Richard's. Then take Avery with you. Richard's jaw tightened. Melissa looked from him to me, and I watched her make a choice without saying it aloud. Avery rose from the bench as her mother walked toward the exit. Mom? Melissa kept moving. Avery lifted the backpack onto one shoulder and hurried after her. The weight pulled her sideways, but she managed 3 or 4 steps before the glass doors closed between them. She stopped. Through the glass, Melissa crossed the stone walkway beside Richard. She did not turn around. Grant's car backed out first. Melissa's followed seconds later. Avery stood so still that people had to move around her. The red taillights disappeared beyond the parking lot. She continued watching, perhaps believing the cars would circle the building and return. The cold air rushed through the doors each time someone entered. Avery's cheeks turned pink, and the backpack strap dug into her shoulder until it left a red mark above her collar. I crouched beside her. Let me carry that. She shook her head. Mom packed it. That was when I noticed how carefully the bag had been prepared. A luggage tag, with Avery's name and birth date, hung from the handle. A small bottle of medication sat in the side pocket. This was not a school bag packed for an afternoon at court. I took off my coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Is she coming back? Avery asked. I looked through the doors at the empty parking space where Melissa's car had been. She said a few days. Avery absorbed that answer with the solemn concentration of a child trying to turn an adult's uncertainty into a promise. I carried the backpack to my car while she walked beside me. The stone steps were damp and cold beneath our shoes. Every few seconds, Avery looked over her shoulder. No one came after us. Inside the car, I turned on the heat and held my hands near the vents. Avery sat in the passenger seat because my back seat was filled with boxes of donated library books. She kept Melissa's gloves in her lap, smoothing each finger as if they were something fragile. Am I staying until Mom remembers me? She asked. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her that mothers did not forget their children. I wanted to promise Melissa would arrive before bedtime, ashamed and apologetic. But Avery had already been given enough promises by adults who found it easier to speak than to stay. I don't know how long you'll be with me, I said. But you will not wait alone. She looked at me for several seconds, then nodded and turned toward the window. At my house, I made grilled cheese and tomato soup. Avery ate half a sandwich, asked whether her mother knew my address, and fell asleep on my couch before I could answer. I covered her with a blanket, then carried the blue backpack into the kitchen. Inside were 7 pairs of underwear, 7 pairs of socks, pajamas, 2 sweaters, jeans, and a neatly folded dress. Beneath the clothes lay her medication, vaccination records, a copy of her birth certificate, and a list of emergency telephone numbers. Everything a child might need for a week had been packed. Everything except an explanation. I searched the smaller compartments, hoping to find a note from Melissa. In the innermost pocket, my fingers touched a folded sheet of paper. The heading read, Temporary Family Placement. Joanne Keller agrees to care for Avery until further notice. Melissa's and Grant's names had already been typed beneath the paragraph. Below them was a blank line labeled, Signature of Temporary Caregiver. I stood at my kitchen counter, listening to Avery breathe in the next room. Melissa had not asked me to keep her daughter for a few days, because the hearing had become complicated. Grant had not been caught unprepared by his new wife's refusal. The clothes, the medical records, and the unsigned agreement told a different story. They had not simply walked away from Avery. They had been waiting for me to sign my name and take responsibility for the child neither of them wanted. I did not sign the paper Melissa had hidden inside Avery's backpack. The next morning, before Avery woke, I placed it in a folder with her birth certificate, medical records, and the list of emergency numbers. Then I called the county child protection office and explained that a 6-year-old had been left with me after her parents walked away from the courthouse. The woman on the phone stopped me twice to make sure she understood. Both parents left? Yes. And neither one gave you legal custody? They left an unsigned temporary placement form. Do not sign anything until a caseworker reviews it. Avery appeared in the kitchen doorway while I was still on the phone. She wore the same clothes from the courthouse and had put her shoes back on, though I remembered taking them off before carrying her to bed. Are we going somewhere? She asked. I covered the receiver. Not yet. She nodded but did not remove her shoes. By noon, a caseworker named Denise Porter was sitting at my kitchen table. She spoke gently to Avery, asked where her parents had gone, and photographed the contents of the blue backpack. When she reached the unsigned placement agreement, her expression changed. Did they discuss this form with you before the hearing? No. I found it after Avery fell asleep. Denise asked whether there might be courthouse security footage. I had not thought of the cameras above the entrance or facing the parking lot. She explained that recordings were often erased after a short period, unless someone requested that they be preserved. Before she left, she contacted the courthouse and began the process of saving the footage as part of the guardianship record. I knew the video existed after that, but I never asked to see the entire recording. I already remembered enough. Avery calling after her mother, Grant walking toward his car, and 2 sets of taillights disappearing while a child waited for them to return. The emergency arrangement solved only the first problem. It allowed Avery to remain with me while the county tried to contact Melissa and Grant, but it did not make me her parent. The school wanted written proof that I could pick her up, approve field trips, and speak to her teachers. The pediatrician could treat a fever, but the office hesitated when I tried to update her records. Every form had a box for mother, father, or legal guardian. I was none of those things. Melissa finally answered Denise's call 3 days later. She said she and Richard were working through housing arrangements. Grant claimed he and Celeste needed time to prepare their home. Neither offered a date. They emailed me a limited authorization allowing me to make ordinary school and medical decisions for 30 days. It looked official enough to keep Avery enrolled, but every sentence reminded me that the people doing nothing still held the power to decide how much I was allowed to do. Avery did not ask when she was leaving during the day. She asked at night. The first week, I found her asleep on top of the blankets with her shoes still tied. The second week, she hid half a sandwich inside the front pocket of her backpack. When I asked why, she stared at the floor. In case we have to go before breakfast. I sat beside her on the bed. You won't be taken anywhere without being told. Mom didn't tell me last time. There was no answer that could make that sentence smaller. I moved my clothes into the narrow guest room and gave Avery my bedroom because it was closest to the bathroom and had a window overlooking the driveway. I thought seeing my car outside each morning might help. For the first month, she checked before getting out of bed. My supervisor at the library reduced my schedule after I explained the situation. She tried to protect as many hours as possible, but I still lost income. The car I had planned to trade in began making a grinding noise every time I turned left. I sold it before it needed another repair and bought a 10-year-old sedan from a coworker's brother. Avery apologized when she saw the faded seats. For what? You had a nicer car before me. I crouched beside the open door. Cars are not more important than people. She looked unconvinced, as if she had already learned that adults often said one thing and chose another. I began proving it in smaller ways. I watched online videos to learn how to part her hair without pulling. My first attempt left one braid higher than the other. Avery studied herself in the mirror, touched both sides and said, "They're not the same." I noticed. She tried not to smile. Maybe next time. I put a calendar on the refrigerator showing who would collect her from school each day. Since there was usually only one name, mine, I made colored cards instead. Green meant I was coming. Blue meant my neighbor Mrs. Hanley was coming. Yellow meant the school should call me before releasing Avery to anyone else. We wrote the names of approved adults beneath the heading, Safe People. Avery insisted on taping one card inside her backpack. The system worked until a delivery truck blocked the library parking lot and made me 7 minutes late. When I reached the school office, Avery was standing against the wall with tears running silently down her face. She did not move when she saw me. "I thought you changed your mind," she whispered. I signed her out with a shaking hand. "About what?" "Keeping me." I knelt in front of her while the secretary pretended not to listen. Being late is not the same as leaving. It felt the same. After that, I began calling the school whenever I might be even a few minutes behind. I also made sure Avery knew the difference between a delay and an abandonment, though it took years before her body believed what her mind understood. Melissa sont occasionnel texte message. How is she? Tell her I love her. Things are still complicated. Grant's messages were shorter. Bosse week. We'll call soon. He rarely did. 2 months after the courthouse, Melissa transferred $25 to my bank account. The note attached to it read, "For child support and continued parental involvement." I stared at the amount, wondering which part of Avery's life it was meant to cover. Her winter coat had cost more. So had one appointment with the therapist Denise recommended. I sent Melissa a list of Avery's recent expenses. She did not reply. Several months later, Grant sent $50, with nearly the same wording, "For support and continued parental involvement." The phrasing irritated me more than the amount. It sounded as though sending a few dollars allowed them to describe themselves as present. At the time, I thought it was only selfishness dressed in formal language. I did not yet understand why the wording mattered. Winter became spring, and Avery stopped carrying her backpack from room to room. She still kept it packed beneath the bed. When she developed the flu, I sat beside her through 2 nights of fever. Near dawn on the second morning, she opened her eyes and reached toward me. "Mom, can I have water?" The word landed between us. Avery's face changed as soon as she heard herself say it. "I meant Joe." I handed her the glass. "Joe is fine." She drank without looking at me. I wanted to tell her she could call me anything that made her feel safe. I wanted to hold that accidental word against my heart. Instead, I tucked the blanket around her and stayed until she fell asleep again. Calling me Mom had to be her choice, not another role an adult placed on her. When the temporary authorization neared its end, I petitioned for long-term legal guardianship. Melissa and Grant both objected in writing, claiming they intended to resume parenting once their homes were stable. Neither submitted a workable plan. Neither attended Avery's school conferences. Neither came when she had the flu. They appeared when paperwork required a response, then disappeared when Avery required care. The court granted me legal guardianship, giving me the authority to handle her schooling, medical treatment, and daily life. It did not allow me to adopt her. Melissa and Grant had made it clear that although they would not take Avery home, they were not prepared to surrender the title of parent. I became responsible for everything while still knowing that 2 people who rarely called could force me back into court whenever they chose. A full year passed. On the anniversary of the divorce hearing, Avery sat beside the living room window, watching cars move through the early evening rain. She was 7 now. Her legs had grown long enough that her feet almost touched the floor. "If they were coming back," she asked quietly, "wouldn't they know where we live?" I stood in the dining room with 3 plates in my hands. For 12 months, I had avoided saying anything that sounded permanent. I had been afraid of promising what a court could still take away. But Avery had spent long enough living as though every meal might be her last one in my house. I placed 2 plates on the table, then pulled another chair from the wall and set the 3rd plate in front of it. "This is your home for as long as you need it." She looked at the chair, then at me. That night, for the first time, she left the blue backpack beneath her bed and came to dinner without checking whether it was still packed. The following afternoon, a certified letter arrived. Melissa and Grant had jointly filed an objection to my petition for permanent guardianship, even though they had not spoken to each other in months. They still would not raise Avery, but they were determined to prevent me from becoming the mother who could. Melissa and Grant's joint objection did not bring either of them back into Avery's life. It only brought lawyers, hearings, and another stack of papers into mine. They continued insisting that they intended to resume parenting someday, yet neither offered Avery a bedroom, a school plan, or even a reliable weekend visit. Their resistance had nothing to do with wanting her home. They simply did not want anyone else to possess the legal certainty they refused to provide. For several years, legal guardianship was the most stability I could secure. It allowed me to sign school forms, approve treatment, and make daily decisions, but every certified envelope still made my stomach tighten. I learned to open the mail away from Avery, so she would not see my hands shake. By the time she was 8, the colored pickup cards had become part of our routine. Green meant I was coming, blue meant Mrs. Hanley, and yellow meant the school had to call me before releasing her to anyone else. Avery kept a copy in her backpack even after she no longer needed to look at it every morning. The cards could tell her who was coming. They could not completely silence the part of her that expected every safe person to disappear. At 10, Avery saw a photograph of Melissa online. She was standing beside Richard outside a large suburban house, smiling with one hand on the shoulder of a little boy and the other around a baby girl. Avery carried my laptop into the kitchen and placed it in front of me. "Those are her children?" I wiped my hands on a dish towel. "They are your mother's younger children. She has rooms for them." It was not a question. I sat beside her. "Yes." "Then why didn't she have one for me?" There were many answers I could have given, and most of them would have made Melissa look exactly as cruel as she had been. I could have told Avery that her mother chose a man who treated her like unwanted luggage. I could have said Grant had done the same thing with Celeste. Instead, I closed the laptop. "Your parents made a wrong choice," I said. "It was never because you were not worth making room for." Avery stared at the dark screen. "People do not accidentally forget a whole child." "No," I admitted. "They don't." She did not cry. That worried me more than if she had. That night, she moved the blue backpack from beneath her bed to the back of her closet. I found it there while putting away laundry, the fabric faded and one zipper beginning to rust. I pushed it behind a box of winter clothes, because I thought hiding it might make the memory smaller. I was wrong about that. Some objects do not lose their weight merely because no one can see them. The years changed my life in quieter ways. I stopped accepting invitations that required me to pretend Avery was temporary. I dated a man named Scott for nearly 6 months, until he suggested that Melissa should take her back before the arrangement became permanent. I ended dinner, paid my half of the bill, and never saw him again. 2 years later, a man named Kevin appeared more understanding. He attended one school concert and helped repaint the porch. Then, when our relationship became serious, he said a boarding school might give Avery structure and allow us to build a life that was finally ours. I looked at him across my kitchen table and realized he believed my life with Avery was a waiting room. "This is the life I built," I told him. "You were being invited into it. You were never being asked to remove her from it." He left before dessert. Relatives treated each breakup as evidence that I had made an unfortunate choice. At a family gathering, one aunt sighed and said, "You are still young enough to have a life of your own. You cannot spend forever raising someone else's child." Avery was in the hallway behind her. I saw her before my aunt did. Her shoulders had drawn inward, as though she was trying to occupy less space. "She is not someone else's child," I said. "She is the child in my home, at my table, and in every decision I make. Anyone who cannot understand that does not belong in our life." Avery said nothing on the drive home, but that evening she left a folded note beside my coffee cup. It read, "Thank you for not sending me away." I kept that note in my wallet for years. When my attorney finally told me we could petition for adoption, I did not tell Avery immediately. I was afraid of giving her hope before the court had spoken. Melissa and Grant submitted formal objections. Once again, they appeared through paperwork rather than presence. At the hearing, Their attorneys pointed to the small transfers they had made over the years. $25 here, $50 there. The judge asked for evidence of meaningful contact, regular support, medical involvement, school participation, or actual plans to care for Avery. There was almost nothing. The payments had not followed a support order. They had been sporadic, automated and disconnected from every real need Avery had ever had. Melissa could not name her teacher. Grant did not know the medication listed in the backpack he had helped pack. After proper notice, testimony, and review of the record, the court found that their consent was no longer required. When the judge approved the adoption, Avery was sitting beside me in a navy dress. She held my hand so tightly that the bones in my fingers ached. Outside the courtroom, she studied the new document for several minutes. Does this mean they cannot take me because they suddenly changed their minds? It means I am legally your mother. You already were. I turned away because I did not want her to see how quickly my eyes filled. Being her mother on paper did not erase the years when I had feared losing her. It also did not erase the strange ache I felt whenever someone used the phrase, real mother. I knew what the law said. I knew what Avery had said. Some part of me still wondered whether blood could someday call louder than memory. At 12, Avery began spending Wednesday evenings in the STEM club held in the library's community room. She was not the loudest student or the fastest coder, but she noticed problems the other children accepted as normal. One evening, I found her spreading our old pickup cards across a table. Green, blue, and yellow rectangles covered the surface beside a borrowed laptop. Daniel Mercer, one of the volunteer mentors, stood across from her. He owned an electronics repair shop downtown and had the patient habit of waiting for a child to finish thinking before he spoke. Avery pointed to the cards. Schools have separate forms for pickup, medicine, and emergency contacts. Foster families and relatives have to carry copies everywhere. What if it was all connected, but the child could still see who was safe? Daniel did not praise her too quickly or take over the idea. He pulled out a chair. Show me how the child would use it. Avery drew a simple screen with circles for approved adults, medication information, and a button for when no one arrived. At the top, she wrote, "Safe person." Daniel tapped the misspelled word with his pencil. "Is that a new kind of superhero?" Avery groaned and crossed it out. "I was writing fast." "Good." Fast means the idea arrived before the spelling did. Over the following months, the paper cards became wireframes, then a crude prototype. Daniel helped her understand what she could build and where she needed other people's skills, but he never described the project as his. He always asked what Avery wanted the next screen to do. She called it one bag. When I asked why, she looked toward the hallway leading to my office. Because when I was 6, everything adults thought I needed fit inside one bag. I knew immediately which bag she meant. That night, after the library closed, I passed the community room and heard Avery speaking to Daniel. She did not know I was outside the door. "I do not care if it becomes a big company," she said. "I just want no child to wonder if anyone is coming." I rested my hand against the wall. For years, I had tried to protect her by hiding the blue backpack and softening the truth about the people who packed it. Avery had found another way to survive. She was turning the worst question of her childhood into an answer for someone else. 2 years later, the first working pilot of One Bag was connected to a small after-school program. Avery stood beside me while we tested the pickup alert on my phone. The screen lit up. "Your safe person is on the way." Avery read the message twice. Then she looked at me, her expression suddenly younger than 14. That's what I needed someone to tell me. 4 years later, an email arrived offering $32 million to buy the company built from that sentence. By the time Avery was 16, One Bag was no longer a project running from a borrowed laptop in the library. Several schools were testing it, along with organizations that helped grandparents, aunts, and other relatives care for children whose parents could not. The screen still resembled the colored cards Avery had once kept in her backpack, but the system now connected pickup permissions, medication records, emergency contacts, and the names of adults a child could safely trust. The offer arrived on a Monday morning, while I was checking overdue book reports in my office. Avery called from the conference room and asked me to come downstairs without explaining why. When I entered, she was sitting beside Maya Brooks, the attorney appointed to protect Avery's interests in the company. Daniel stood near the whiteboard with both hands pressed against the edge of the table, looking as stunned as Avery did. Maya turned her laptop toward me. A national education technology company has submitted a preliminary acquisition offer. The number on the screen contained more zeros than my mind could process. $32 million? I asked. Avery stared at me as if she needed my face to confirm the number was real. Maya immediately slowed us down. She explained that no one was handing Avery a check for $32 million. The offer was for the company, subject to negotiations, taxes, contracts, and a full examination of who had created the software, who owned the code, and whether anyone else could claim part of it. Avery's shares were protected through a structure that kept me from controlling or spending her money. My name did not appear as a founder or owner, because one bag belonged to Avery and the team that had helped build it. I was only her mother. That was the only title I had ever wanted. The news still traveled faster than the paperwork. The company issued a short statement after the first agreement was signed, and a local reporter wrote a story about the teenager who had turned a childhood fear into a safety platform. The article included a photograph of Avery standing in the library's community room, with the One Bag logo displayed behind her. 2 days later, an email arrived from Melissa. The subject line read, "For Avery." I opened it alone in my office. The message was longer than anything Melissa had sent during the previous 10 years. She wrote that she had followed Avery's accomplishments from a distance because she did not want to disrupt her life. She said she had respected my role and waited until Avery was old enough to make her own choices. The final sentence read, "I've never stopped thinking about my daughter." I read it 3 times, but the words did not change into an apology. There was no mention of the courthouse, the blue backpack, or the years Melissa had spent raising 2 younger children, while Avery learned not to wait by the window. She wrote as though time and distance had happened to her, rather than being choices she had made. Grant called the same afternoon. I almost let the number go to voicemail, but Avery was sitting across from me when it appeared on the screen. He sounded older than I remembered. He said he had spent years in therapy and finally understood the damage he had caused. He claimed Celeste had pressured him into making decisions he regretted, though he never explained why regret had not led him to call before Avery's name appeared beside $32 million. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I only want a chance to tell her I'm sorry." When I ended the call, Avery remained silent for a long time. She was not crying, and she did not look hopeful. She looked like someone studying a locked door to decide whether opening it would answer anything, or only let danger inside. "You do not have to meet them," I told her. "I know. You do not owe them forgiveness." "I know that too." She folded Melissa's email along the crease I had made when printing it. "I want to know what they want." The sentence frightened me, because it was the same question I had been asking. Part of me wanted to refuse the meeting and place every legal barrier I could between Avery and the people who had abandoned her. Another part remembered how carefully I had avoided speaking for her during the adoption. If I stopped the meeting without letting her decide, Melissa could claim I was still keeping Avery away. We agreed to one conversation at the library after closing. I would be present, and so would Daniel. Maya advised us not to discuss the acquisition terms or share confidential company material. Melissa arrived first, carrying a small stuffed rabbit with one ear folded forward. She held it out to Avery with both hands. "You had one just like this when you were little." Avery studied the toy. "Mine was a brown dog." Melissa's smile faltered. "Of course. I remembered you always slept with something soft." Grant arrived several minutes later and tried to recover the warmth Melissa had failed to create. He told Avery he remembered taking her to a county fair where she had been terrified of the Ferris wheel. "I loved the Ferris wheel," Avery said. "I was afraid of the haunted house." Grant laughed too loudly. "That's right, the haunted house." Neither memory was important by itself. What mattered was how quickly they adjusted whenever Avery corrected them, as though they were assembling a childhood from whatever pieces she gave them. They repeated that they did not want money. Melissa said she only wanted Avery to understand that people could make terrible choices and still love their children. Grant spoke about second chances and healing. Neither asked what therapy Avery had needed, what school she attended, or what frightened her now. Then Melissa glanced toward the One Bag logo projected on the wall. "Would you show us what you built?" she asked. "Not the business side. I just want to see what my daughter created." Avery looked at me. I reminded her that the public presentation was safe to share. She opened the same version used for schools and community partners, explaining the approved pickup list, emergency information, and the alert sent when a child's designated adult was delayed. Melissa leaned forward. "And the Safe Circle sync? Does that update everyone automatically?" Avery stopped speaking. Safe Circle Sync was an internal working name for a feature still being tested. It had never appeared in the public presentation or the news article. Daniel looked at me across the table. Melissa seemed to realize she had said too much. "I must have read it somewhere." "Where?" Daniel asked. She reached for the stuffed rabbit. "One of the articles, probably." There had been no article about that feature. While our attention remained on Melissa, Grant wandered toward the whiteboard. Avery had left several diagrams there after a product meeting earlier that week. He took out his phone, held it near his chest, and lowered it before I could clearly see what he was doing. "Please don't photograph anything in this room," I said. He looked offended. "I was checking a message." The meeting ended soon afterward. Melissa hugged Avery without waiting for permission, and Grant placed a hand on her shoulder as though a single touch could bridge 10 years. They left together, despite arriving separately. Once the door closed, Daniel walked to the whiteboard. "They knew the internal feature name," he said, and Grant pointed his camera at this. Avery's face hardened. "They said they didn't want anything." I tried to find an innocent explanation. Maya had access to the development records. So did the prospective buyer and several members of the engineering team. Perhaps someone had mentioned the name during due diligence. Perhaps a document had been sent to the wrong address. The alternative was that Melissa and Grant had entered the room already knowing more than they should. That night, I was loading the dishwasher when Maya called. Her voice had none of the measured calm she usually used around Avery. "Joanne, the buyer's legal team received a claim this afternoon. Someone is alleging that One Bag was built from a family safety plan created 10 years ago." I gripped the edge of the counter. "Who filed it?" Maya hesitated just long enough for my stomach to tighten. "Melissa Vance and Grant Hale." Maya asked us to meet before the library opened the next morning. When Avery and I entered the conference room, the blinds were closed and 3 thick folders lay beside Maya's laptop. Daniel was already there, standing near the window with his coat still on. Maya did not begin with reassurance. "The buyer has paused the acquisition," she said. "They have not withdrawn the offer, but they will not move forward until this claim is examined." Avery sat beside me. Her face remained calm, but I felt her knee begin to bounce beneath the table. Maya opened the first folder and placed a document between us. Across the top, in formal blue lettering, were the words, "Family Transition" and "Child Safety Blueprint." The date printed beneath the title was 3 weeks before Melissa and Grant left Avery at the courthouse. I read the first page once, then again more slowly. The document described a system intended to help a child move safely between separated households. It included a list of approved adults, medical information, pickup permissions, and an emergency notification if no caregiver arrived. Those were the foundations of One Bag. Melissa and Grant claimed they had created the plan while preparing for their divorce. According to the filing, they had asked me to carry it out when they temporarily placed Avery in my care. Years later, they said, I gave their ideas to Avery and helped turn them into a commercial product without acknowledging where the concept began. Avery looked at me. Did you ever see this? Not like this. Maya turned several pages. Melissa's signature appeared at the bottom of one form. Grant's was beside it. I recognized both. A notary stamp had been pressed beneath them, along with a commission number and a date. It looked real, because parts of it were real. That was what made it dangerous. Maya showed me an email I had sent Melissa during Avery's first month in my home. I had written that the school needed a list of adults authorized to collect her and complete medical information in case of an emergency. Another email described the colored pickup cards I had made for Avery. The filing quoted both messages as evidence that I was implementing their family safety plan. They removed the dates from the email headers, I said. The originals are attached farther back, Maya replied. But the quotations appear before them. Anyone reading quickly could believe the blueprint came first and your emails followed. Another page included the temporary placement form from the blue backpack. My blank signature line had been cropped out. In the version Melissa and Grant submitted, the page ended directly beneath their names, making it appear complete. I felt heat move up my neck. They are using the paper I refused to sign as proof that I agreed to their plan. That is their position. Daniel moved closer to the table. What exactly are they asking for? Maya closed the folder. Recognition as the original concept creators, a financial share of the acquisition, and the right to participate in negotiations concerning the product. Avery gave a short, disbelieving laugh. They did not even know what school I attended. The claim is not based on how well they parented, Maya said gently. It is based on whether one bag was derived from intellectual property they say they created. The difference felt obscene. Melissa and Grant had found a way to separate Avery's pain from the choices that caused it. They wanted the useful parts of her childhood without accepting responsibility for what those years had cost her. Maya explained that the buyer's legal team would examine the document history, software development records, and every person who had access to early versions of one bag. Until that review was complete, the company could not risk completing a $32 million purchase. Avery looked toward Daniel. Who had access to the first designs? You, me, Joanne, and the other mentors who helped with the club, he said. Later, the startup team and the pilot program. Could someone have changed an old file? I asked. Daniel's expression tightened, but he answered without defensiveness. Anyone with a copy could create a new document and make it look old. The harder question is where they got the exact language. Maya turned the screen toward us. Several sentences in the blueprint matched wording from one bag's early project notes. Not just the general idea, specific phrases. One page referred to a safe circle. Another used the phrase, "no child left waiting." A diagram showed 3 colored categories for approved pickup adults. I remembered the meeting 2 nights earlier. Melissa had known the internal name Safe Circle Sync before Avery explained it. Grant had held his phone near the whiteboard. They took something during the meeting, I said. Possibly, Maya replied. But this filing was submitted only hours later. Some of the material would have required more preparation. That meant they had already been building the claim before they walked into the library pretending to want forgiveness. The room fell silent as another possibility settled over us. Someone with access to Avery's earlier records might have helped them. Daniel understood before I said anything. He sat down and placed his phone, laptop, and a small external drive on the table. You should examine everything. Avery looked at him. Daniel, I didn't say you did it. You should still examine everything, he repeated. I kept backup copies of her early work because the club computers were unreliable. If any file came from me, I want to know how. There was no anger in his voice, but the distance he placed between himself and us hurt. For years, Daniel had protected Avery's ownership of the idea. Now the documents made every person around her a possible doorway. Maya accepted the drive and explained that an independent specialist would preserve and inspect the records. Daniel signed the release without hesitation. When the meeting ended, Avery did not follow me into the hallway. She remained at the table, staring at the temporary placement form on Maya's screen. "You knew about that paper," she said. I stopped. "The one from the backpack. You knew they had planned to leave me with you. I found it that first night. And you never told me?" "I told you they had asked me to keep you temporarily." "That is not the same thing." Daniel quietly gathered his coat and left with Maya, giving us the room without making the moment more obvious. I returned to the chair beside Avery. "You were 6 years old." "I am not 6 now." "No. Then why didn't you tell me when I was old enough?" I looked at the cropped document on the screen. For 10 years, I had believed I was protecting her by choosing the gentlest version of the truth. I had said Melissa and Grant were overwhelmed. I had said their new homes were complicated. I had described the courthouse as a terrible decision made during a painful divorce. I had never told Avery that her clothes, medication, and birth certificate had been packed before the hearing ended. I had never shown her the agreement waiting for my signature. "I wanted you to believe they had made one terrible choice," I said. "I did not want you growing up thinking they had planned to leave you. But they did plan it." "Yes." The words seemed to alter the air between us. Avery folded her arms across her chest. "Did you think knowing would break me? I thought it might make you believe you were unwanted. They left me on courthouse steps. I already knew what that felt like. I had no defense against that." She stood and walked to the whiteboard, where the remains of her product notes had been erased. Only faint blue lines remained beneath the cleaner. "All these years, you told me they were weak," she said. "You never told me they were prepared. I was trying to keep their failure from becoming the way you saw yourself." She turned toward me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice stayed controlled. "Were you protecting me, or protecting the version of them you hoped was still true?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. The honest answer was both. I had wanted Avery free from the belief that her parents had carefully packed her life into one bag. But some part of me had also wanted to believe Melissa had acted impulsively, because accepting the truth meant admitting my stepsister had looked at a 6-year-old child, planned her departure, and left a blank signature line for me to complete. Avery picked up her jacket. "I need some time." I did not stop her. Daniel was waiting outside the library doors and drove her to school after she asked him, not me. For the first time since she was 6, I watched Avery leave with someone else and wondered whether she still saw me as her safe person. I spent the morning helping Maya separate authentic records from the pages that felt unfamiliar. The signatures were real. My emails were real. The temporary form was real. The blueprint surrounding them was something else, but we still needed proof. Near noon, Daniel returned carrying a cardboard storage box from the STEM club. He placed it on the conference table and began sorting through old notebooks, printed screens, and student worksheets. "I kept the paper versions before we started backing everything up digitally," he said. Avery's handwriting appeared across dozens of pages. Some contained rough sketches of screens that never became part of one bag. Others showed early versions of the safe person list. Daniel stopped at a worksheet dated 4 years earlier. At the top, 12-year-old Avery had written the words, "safe person," before angrily crossing them out. Daniel opened the blueprint beside it and turned to a diagram supposedly created when Avery was 6. The same misspelled phrase appeared beneath one of the circles. Safe person. Not corrected, not paraphrased. Copied exactly from a mistake Avery had not made until 6 years after the document's alleged creation. Daniel looked at me. "This cannot be the original blueprint." The misspelled phrase was enough to prove that the blueprint could not have been created when Avery was 6, but Maya warned us that one copied mistake would not end the dispute. Melissa and Grant could claim the phrase had been added later by someone else, or that the dated blueprint had gone through revisions. We needed to show when Avery had created the original material and how it had moved from her notebook into one bag. Daniel's backups gave us that chain. His external drive contained a scanned copy of Avery's worksheet, saved the same evening she wrote "safe person" at 12. The club's attendance log showed she had presented the idea that night, and a later file documented when the corrected phrase became safe person. None of those records had existed at the time Melissa and Grant claimed their blueprint had been written. Maya's specialist verified that Daniel's files had not been altered after the fact. His backups did more than clear him. They showed that several phrases and diagrams in the blueprint had been copied from Avery's work years after her biological parents had left her. Avery was present when Maya explained the results. She sat across from Daniel, twisting the cuff of her sweater around one finger. The distance that had opened between us the previous morning had not disappeared, but she no longer looked at him with suspicion. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should not have wondered whether you gave them anything." Daniel shook his head. "You were shown a document designed to make you doubt everyone who helped you. That is what it was built to do." His answer made me understand the real purpose of the claim. Melissa and Grant did not need us to believe their story forever. They only needed to fracture the people around Avery long enough for the buyer to become nervous and the acquisition to collapse. They moved to the next stage before we could finish examining the first. A local news account posted a short video from the day of the divorce hearing. The clip showed Avery standing near me outside the courthouse, then showed me placing her blue backpack in my car and helping her into the passenger seat. Melissa and Grant appeared several yards away, separated from us by the angle of the camera. The recording had not survived inside a courthouse system for 10 years. It had been preserved during the original guardianship case, and both biological parents had once received access to copies because they were parties to that case. One of them had kept a copy and removed everything that gave the scene its meaning. The clip did not show Melissa handing over the packed backpack. It did not show Grant refusing to take Avery home. It did not show both parents leaving the parking lot while I ran after them and asked when they planned to return. Without those moments, the video looked like I had arrived with Avery already beside me and calmly driven away while her parents remained behind. The headline above it asked, "Did Joanne Keller rescue a child? Or take advantage of a broken family?" By lunchtime, other accounts had repeated the question, as though asking it made both possibilities equally credible. Melissa appeared in a recorded interview that afternoon. She sat in a bright living room with framed family photographs behind her and spoke in the careful, wounded voice she used whenever she wanted cruelty to sound reasonable. "Joanne was lonely," she said. "She did not have children of her own. At first, we were grateful she helped during a difficult divorce, but over time she began presenting herself as the heroic mother, and us as monsters. She claimed I had discouraged contact and taught Avery to see every attempt at reconciliation as a threat." Grant released his own statement saying I had controlled communication, hidden important milestones, and built my identity around keeping his daughter dependent on me. Then he said the sentence that followed me everywhere for the next several days. "She wasted her life raising someone else's child, and now she wants to be paid for it." I was not being paid for one bag. My name was not on the acquisition as a founder, and I held no ownership Avery had not chosen to give. The accusation still spread because it was simpler than the truth. A lonely woman stealing a child for purpose made a cleaner headline than two parents carefully avoiding responsibility. At the library, conversations stopped when I entered the staff room. A woman at the circulation desk who had known me for 9 years asked whether I had really prevented Avery from seeing her parents. A stranger photographed me outside the building and called my name as though I owed him an explanation. I kept working, but my body betrayed how little the attention felt like ordinary gossip. Every vibration of my phone tightened my chest. Every person who glanced up when I crossed a room made me wonder which version of my life they had chosen to believe. Avery saw more than I wanted her to. One evening, she found me in the kitchen deleting messages from people who called me a kidnapper, an opportunist, and a failed woman who had stolen motherhood because I could not create it myself. "Let me answer them," she said. "I can post the adoption order. I can tell them what happened." I put the phone face down. "Not yet. They are lying about you. And if you respond while we are still missing part of the evidence, they will turn your pain into another argument." Her jaw tightened. So I am supposed to watch them destroy you? No. You are supposed to keep your story until you can tell it on your terms. The words sounded stronger than I felt. I also knew that asking Avery to wait risked repeating the mistake I had already made by deciding which truths she was ready to carry. This time, however, the delay was not meant to protect Melissa or Grant. It was meant to keep them from forcing Avery into a public confession before she had chosen what she wanted to say. Maya called a meeting with the company's board representatives. The buyer had not withdrawn the offer, but their patience had limits. Every additional claim increased legal costs and made the acquisition harder to defend. One board member suggested paying Melissa and Grant a modest settlement in exchange for withdrawing the ownership dispute and ending the media campaign. He described it as purchasing certainty, not rewarding misconduct. The phrase made me feel ill. Paying them might protect Avery's company and keep the full guardianship record from becoming public. Fighting them could require us to open the most painful parts of her childhood, including documents she had only recently learned existed. I could preserve the money by allowing two people who had abandoned her to profit from returning, or I could protect the truth by risking the thing she had spent years building. Daniel waited until the others had left before speaking. He did not tell me that money was unimportant, because $32 million could change Avery's future and help thousands of children. He also did not tell me to release the records, because they belonged to Avery's life, not his principles. He asked only one question. Which choice lets Avery own her own story? I looked through the conference room window. Avery was sitting alone at a table in the library, her laptop open but untouched. Melissa and Grant had already taken her childhood once, by deciding where she would not be allowed to live. I could not let them take it again by deciding which version of that childhood the world would hear. I called Maya and told her to request lawful access to the sealed guardianship file. I wanted the certified copy of the complete courthouse video that had been preserved in 2016, not the edited version Melissa and Grant had released. I also authorized a full review of every document they had submitted, including the temporary placement form, the notary record, and the history of the blueprint. Before Maya could file the requests, a courier delivered a sealed envelope from Melissa and Grant's attorneys. Across the front were the words, "Confidential Settlement Offer." Inside, they demanded 30% of the acquisition proceeds, public recognition as One Bag's original concept creators, and one final condition. At every public event concerning the company, Avery would be required to call them Mom and Dad. The settlement offer did not ask Melissa and Grant to become part of Avery's life. It asked Avery to rewrite her life so they could profit from it. Maya read the terms aloud in her office the following morning, while Avery sat beside me. Melissa and Grant wanted 30% of whatever Avery received from the acquisition. They wanted to be publicly recognized as the original creators of the idea behind One Bag. They wanted the right to use Avery's name, image, and childhood story in interviews, promotional material, and any future documentary about the company. They also wanted one public reunion interview in which Avery would describe them as parents who had made painful sacrifices during a difficult divorce. The agreement prohibited me from using the word abandoned. The final condition required Avery to call them Mom and Dad at public events connected to the sale. Avery took the document from Maya and read that paragraph herself. Her fingers tightened around the pages. "They are asking me to lie. They are asking you to approve their version of the past," Maya said. Grant's attorneys had included another threat. If we rejected the offer, he would petition for a formal review of every financial decision I had made on Avery's behalf, including the company shares held for her protection. The claim had little substance, but defending against it would cost time, expose private records, and give him another opportunity to describe me as a woman who had raised Avery for money. Melissa requested to speak with me privately before we responded. Maya advised against meeting alone, so the conversation took place in a smaller room with the door open and her seated just outside. Melissa arrived wearing the same soft expression she had used in the interview. Once the cameras were absent, it disappeared. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "You demanded 30% of something Avery built. She built it from our family's experience. She built it from being left behind by you." Melissa glanced toward the open doorway. "You should be careful with that word. Abandoned?" Her mouth tightened. I waited for her to deny it. Instead, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You should be grateful. Raising her gave your life a purpose." For a moment, I could not answer. I thought of the nights Avery slept in her shoes, the school office where she cried because I was 7 minutes late, and the note she had left beside my coffee cup thanking me for not sending her away. Melissa had taken every one of those years and reduced them to a favor Avery had done for me. "You believe I needed your daughter more than she needed someone to stay," I said. "You were alone, Joanne. Everyone knew it. Then Avery came along, and suddenly you had a reason to matter." The cruelty in her voice was not anger. It was certainty. Melissa truly believed my love for Avery had been a weakness she could use against me. Grant entered before I could respond. He had apparently decided the private conversation was taking too long. "If we cannot settle this," he said, "I will ask the court to examine how you managed her assets. Every account, every contract, and every decision. You know I cannot access her protected shares. Then you should have nothing to fear." Maya stepped into the room. "Threatening an unnecessary review does not improve your ownership claim." Grant shrugged. "It improves my negotiating position." That sentence removed whatever remained of his performance as a remorseful father. Neither he nor Melissa had returned to ask what Avery needed. They had returned because they believed parenthood was an asset they had forgotten to collect. After they left, Maya told us the truth without softening it. We could negotiate, reducing the percentage, removing the public interview, and changing the language might protect the acquisition. The buyer wanted certainty, and certainty sometimes meant paying people whose claims were weak but expensive to defeat. "If we reject every term and continue fighting," she said, "the buyer may walk away. Even if we eventually prove the blueprint was fabricated, Avery could lose this transaction. $32 million could secure Avery's future. It could expand One Bag into thousands of schools and fund support for children being raised by relatives." I understood why a settlement might look practical. Then I looked at Avery. She was no longer reading the amount. She was staring at the paragraph requiring her to call Melissa and Grant Mom and Dad. Agreeing would not merely cost money. It would teach Avery that the people who abandoned her could return when she became valuable, purchase the language of forgiveness, and own part of whatever she created from surviving them. If protecting $32 million means teaching my daughter that people can abandon her and still own her, then we walk away, I said. Maya held my gaze. "Are you asking me to reject the settlement?" "I am asking you to freeze the acquisition until we know the truth. No payment, no public reunion, and no false statement." Avery turned toward me. I had not realized she believed I might choose differently until I saw the relief on her face. Maya left to notify the buyer. Avery and I remained in the room after the door closed. The anger between us from the previous days had not vanished, but something inside it had changed. "You really would let the deal disappear?" she asked. "I would rather watch the money disappear than watch them sell your childhood back to you." Her eyes filled. "I thought you might regret everything if the company failed because of me. This is not because of you. I mean more than the company." She looked down at her hands. "The men who left. The money you spent. The job hours you lost. People keep saying you gave up your life for me. Sometimes I wonder whether you believe it too." I moved my chair closer. "I am sorry I made the truth about the courthouse smaller than it was. I thought I was protecting you, but I also protected myself from admitting how deliberate they had been." Avery wiped one cheek with the back of her hand. "You did not take my life," I said. "I chose the life in which no one got to ask me to abandon you." She leaned into me, and for several minutes neither of us tried to explain anything else. When we returned home, Avery went directly to the hallway closet. She moved 2 boxes of winter clothes and reached behind them for the blue backpack. The fabric had faded, but the red mark I remembered on her shoulder returned to me so sharply that my own skin seemed to ache. "I want to open it," she said. We carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were the same carefully folded clothes, now far too small, along with the medication bottle, vaccination records, and copy of her birth certificate. The temporary placement form remained in the inner pocket, still waiting for the signature I had refused to provide. A business card was wedged behind it. The card belonged to a family law office that had closed several years earlier. Beneath the office, name was the name Eleanor Price, legal secretary. Maya located her the next day. Eleanor was 67 and living outside Dayton. She agreed to speak by video after Maya explained which case we were reviewing. Eleanor remembered Melissa because of the unusual request she had made several weeks after the divorce hearing. Melissa had wanted documents recreated with language, suggesting that Joanne had agreed to care for Avery before the hearing ended. She said the original arrangement had not been written clearly enough, Eleanor recalled. I told her we could not change the date of an agreement that had not been signed. "Did Grant know?" Maya asked. "He came to the office with her the second time." Eleanor closed her eyes, searching her memory. Melissa kept saying, "We need it to look like Joanne agreed," before the hearing ended. The sentence explained why authentic signatures, real emails, and later language had been stitched together. They had not preserved an old family plan. They had constructed one after leaving Avery with me. Maya spent the next several hours comparing Eleanor's account with the payment records Melissa and Grant had used to prove continued parental involvement. She called me that evening. Every small transfer, from the first $25 to the final $50, had been scheduled automatically on the same calendar date each year. Each carried nearly identical legal wording. There were no birthday messages, questions about school, or references to anything happening in Avery's life. Melissa and Grant had never maintained a relationship. They had maintained a record. The payment records gave Maya a pattern. The rest of the evidence gave that pattern a purpose. Over the next several days, she reconstructed what Melissa and Grant had done, not as 2 frightened parents making poor decisions, but as 2 adults carefully separating the responsibilities of parenthood from the rights they wanted to preserve. They had left Avery in my care in real life, but they had tried to remain her parents on paper. The temporary placement agreement was meant to make the courthouse abandonment look like a planned family arrangement. Their occasional transfers created a record they could point to as financial support. Their written objections to guardianship and adoption allowed them to claim they had never willingly surrendered their daughter, even while neither of them offered to take her home. They wanted the legal appearance of involvement without the cost of actual care, Maya said. We were sitting in her office with the blinds closed and the conference table buried beneath documents. Avery had chosen to stay at school that morning while Maya and I reviewed the most painful material. I was grateful she had made that decision for herself, rather than waiting for me to decide what she could bear. At first, this was not about one bag, Maya continued. There was no company to steal 10 years ago. Their original motives were smaller, but no less cruel. Melissa wanted to enter her new marriage without being known as a woman who had formally abandoned her daughter. Grant wanted to avoid a support order that reflected the true cost of raising Avery. Neither wanted the financial or social consequences of taking responsibility, but both wanted the ability to say they remained parents. Then Avery became valuable. Melissa had followed local articles about one bag months before contacting us. Grant had searched the company name and the acquisition process. Their reunion requests began only after news of the offer appeared. They had not returned, and then discovered the money. They had discovered the money and designed their return around it. Maya's specialist traced the blueprint through several versions. The files submitted to the buyer had been exported recently, even though its cover page carried a date from 2016. Parts of it had been copied from old custody documents. Other pages contained language from one bag's later development notes. The notary stamp created another problem for Melissa and Grant. The commission number belonged to a real notary, but the entry did not appear in her journal on the date printed beneath the signatures. The notary had witnessed a different document months later. Someone had copied the stamp onto the blueprint. Then there was safe person, Avery's misspelling from when she was 12. A feature described as safe circle sync had not existed until years after the alleged blueprint date. Another diagram included a symbol Avery, created during the pilot program, when she changed the shape of the emergency button, because younger children mistook the original one for a game icon. Every page they had added to strengthen their claim pushed the document farther into the future. Maya placed 2 printed text messages in front of me. They had been recovered from records attached to an older dispute over the guardianship case. Grant had written, "As long as we keep parental involvement on record, Joanne can't erase us." Melissa had replied, "And if Avery ever becomes something, we are still her parents." I stared at the second message until the words blurred. They had not predicted that Avery would create a company worth $32 million. They had not known what she would become. That was what made the message worse. They had preserved their claim to her, as though a child were an account they might need later. "She was 6, I said. They were already talking about what she might become. Maya's voice softened. They were talking about what she might become worth to them. The certified copy of the courthouse video arrived that afternoon. Maya had not attempted to retrieve footage from the courthouse's current security system. The original caseworker had requested that the recording be preserved in 2016 before the routine system erased it. A complete copy had been filed with the guardianship record, where it remained under restricted access. The version Melissa and Grant released online had come from the same preserved evidence, but it had been cut down to less than a minute. Maya placed both recordings on one screen. The public clip appeared on the left. The certified version appeared on the right. For the first 20 seconds, the images matched. Then the edited version jumped forward. The complete video continued. Melissa crossed the courthouse walkway carrying the blue backpack. She placed it beside Avery, spoke to me, and walked toward Richard. Grant stood several yards away while I pointed toward Avery and questioned him. Even without audio, I remembered every word. "My new wife won't take her. Neither will my husband. We'll find her another family." On the screen, Avery lifted the backpack and ran toward Melissa. The strap pulled her sideways. Melissa did not turn around. Grant entered his car first. I followed him, stopping near the driver's window. He backed away while I was still speaking. Melissa's car left seconds later. The camera angle showed Avery standing beside the courthouse doors. She watched one vehicle, then another, then a third leave the parking lot. Her head turned each time headlights moved, as though she was counting every car that might circle back for her. I had remembered that afternoon for 10 years, but memory had protected me in small ways. I remembered Avery's voice and the cold stone beneath our feet. I had not remembered how long she stood alone before I reached her. The video forced me to watch every second. My hands began to shake. I pressed them beneath the table, but Maya noticed and stopped the recording. "That is enough for today." "No," I said. "I spent 10 years making it smaller. I need to see what actually happened." I watched myself remove my coat and wrap it around Avery. I watched her continue looking toward the road even after I lifted the backpack. I watched us walk to my car while she turned around 3 separate times. The public version removed all of that. It did not merely shorten the scene. It changed who had left and who had stayed. When Avery arrived after school, Maya told her the full video had been found in the old guardianship record. She asked whether Avery wanted to watch it and made clear that refusing would not weaken our case. Avery chose to see only the beginning and the point where both cars left. When the 6-year-old version of herself appeared on the screen, she gripped the sleeves of her sweater. She did not cry. She watched Melissa place the backpack beside her, then watched Grant walk away. "Stop there," she said when the cars disappeared. Maya closed the video. Avery sat in silence before asking, "Did they know this full copy still existed?" "They knew it had been filed," Maya said. "They relied on the public seeing only the section they released." That evening, the buyer's legal team received the metadata report, the notary discrepancy, Daniel's time-stamped files, the complete video, and the settlement demand for 30%. After reviewing the initial findings, they agreed not to withdraw the offer while the final examination was completed. A formal meeting was arranged for the following day. Maya would present the results to the board, the buyer, and both sides. Melissa and Grant had already been warned that their ownership claim was collapsing. They still planned to attend. Their attorneys had shifted away from arguing that they created one bag. Instead, they were emphasizing that Melissa and Grant were Avery's biological parents, and that the company would not exist without the family experience they had provided. Even after the documents failed them, they believed blood could give them the moral authority the evidence had taken away. At home that night, Avery removed the blue backpack from the kitchen chair. She carried it to the front door and placed it beside her shoes. "I want it in the room tomorrow," she said. I looked at the faded fabric, then at my daughter. "Are you sure you want to speak?" Avery rested one hand on the handle. "I have spent 10 years letting adults explain what happened to me." The conference room was smaller than I expected for a meeting that could decide the future of a $32 million company. The buyer's representatives sat along one side of the table, the one-bag board and attorneys along the other. 2 reporters had been admitted under strict conditions, and several members of our family sat near the back. Daniel took the chair behind Avery and me without trying to move closer. Avery placed the blue backpack on the floor between our chairs. She had carried it into the building herself, one hand wrapped around the faded handle. For most of the morning she had barely spoken, but she did not look frightened. She looked focused, as if every year since the courthouse had been leading her toward a sentence she was finally ready to say. Melissa entered with Richard and 2 attorneys. Grant arrived moments later with Celeste. Neither biological parent looked at the backpack. They looked at the buyer, the board, and the reporters. Maya began without drama. She explained that the investigation had found no valid basis for Melissa and Grant's ownership claim. The so-called family transition and child safety blueprint had not been created before the divorce. Its later pages contained language, diagrams, and a spelling error copied from work Avery completed years afterward. She showed the notary discrepancy, Daniel's dated backups, and the development history of one bag. She explained that the complete courthouse video had been preserved in the original guardianship record, and that the public clip released by Melissa and Grant had removed the moments, showing them leaving Avery behind. Maya did not need to describe every dollar they had sent. One page was enough. The transfers had occurred automatically, carried nearly identical legal language, and had no connection to Avery's actual needs. Then Maya displayed the confidential settlement demand. 30% of the acquisition. Public credit as original concept creators. Rights to Avery's name and story. A requirement that I never use the word abandoned. A requirement that Avery call them mom and dad. The buyer's lead attorney closed the folder in front of him. Based on the evidence presented, the ownership claim is rejected. The proposed transaction may continue once the remaining contractual adjustments are completed. I had imagined that decision would bring relief. Instead, I felt only the pressure of Avery's hand inside mine. Winning the legal argument had not erased the fact that the 2 people across from us still believed they possessed something the documents could not grant them. Melissa stood before her attorney could stop her. "Whatever the paperwork says, I am still her biological mother." Her voice carried clearly through the room. She looked toward the reporters, not toward Avery. Grant leaned forward. "Without us, there would be no girl, no story, and no app." The statement struck me harder than the forged blueprint. They had lost the right to claim Avery's work, so they were claiming ownership of her existence. Melissa pointed across the table at me. "She is not her real mother. She is a lonely woman who wasted 10 years raising someone else's child. My chair scraped the floor as I began to stand. I had spent years swallowing insults to keep Avery from standing inside an adult war. This time, I could not remain silent while Melissa turned love into humiliation. Avery tightened her hand around mine. Then she released it and stood instead. The room changed. The rustling of papers stopped. Even Melissa seemed startled that Avery had chosen to speak without being invited. Avery looked first at Grant, then at Melissa. When I was 6, I stood outside the courthouse and counted cars. Her voice trembled on the first sentence, but she did not lower her eyes. I thought Mom had forgotten my coat and was coming back for it. I thought Dad was looking for another parking space. Every time headlights moved, I believed one of you had changed your mind. Melissa opened her mouth, but one of her attorneys touched her arm. No one came back, Avery continued. I did not understand that both of your new families had already decided there was no place for me. I only understood that I had one backpack and no idea where I was supposed to sleep. She turned slightly toward me. She wrapped her coat around me. She carried my bag. She sat beside my bed when I had nightmares and stayed awake when I was sick. She worked extra hours when she could and gave up hours when I needed her. She learned how to do my hair, came to every school meeting, and created a system so I would always know who was coming to get me. My vision blurred, but I did not look away. She ended relationships with men who treated me like something temporary, not because I asked her to. I did not even know until later. She never told me I had cost her a husband, a career, or a better life. She never called me a burden. Avery looked back at Melissa and Grant. You said she wasted her life raising someone else's child. She never made me feel like someone else's child. Grant shifted in his seat. This does not change the fact that the app exists because of our family circumstances. Avery nodded once. You are right about one thing. One bag exists because I knew what it felt like when no one came. The stillness in the room became absolute. But you did not give me the idea. You gave me the fear. There is a difference. She placed one hand on the table. Mom helped me turn that fear into something useful. The pickup list came from the cards she made for me. The safe person system came from the way she made sure I always knew who would arrive. The emergency alert exists because she understood that being 7 minutes late could feel like being abandoned all over again. Melissa's face hardened at the word mom. Do not call her mom in front of me. Avery became calmer. She bent down, lifted the blue backpack, and set it on the table between them. The fabric looked small and worn beneath the bright conference room lights. This is what you packed when I was 6. Clothes for a week, medicine, school records, and a paper waiting for her signature. You prepared everything except a reason for me to believe I mattered. Melissa stared at the bag but said nothing. Avery rested her palm on its faded surface. You keep saying you gave me life. You did. But when that life became inconvenient, you left it on courthouse steps with one backpack. She picked it up, carried it home, and spent 10 years teaching me that life was worth protecting. My breath caught, but Avery continued before I could reach for her. She never raised someone else's child. She raised her daughter. Then she looked directly at the woman who had demanded to be called her mother. You said you would find me another family. She did not find one for me. She became it. She is the only woman I have ever known as my real mother. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came out. Grant stared at the closed folder in front of him. They had lost the ownership claim. Their documents had exposed their plan, and now the daughter they believed blood entitled them to possess had rejected the only argument they had left. I did not need to speak. The buyer's representative waited until Avery sat down before confirming that the acquisition process would resume. Avery asked for one additional condition before any final agreement was signed. Melissa and Grant were to receive no right to use her name, image, childhood history, or the one bag story in interviews, promotions, or private business ventures. They do not own the app, she said. They do not own what happened to me either. The attorneys agreed to draft the restriction into the final documents. When the meeting ended, people approached us slowly, but Daniel did not rush forward or wrap his arms around me. He waited until the room had emptied enough for Avery to breathe. Then he picked up the blue backpack and held it out to her. "Do you want to carry it, or are you ready to let someone else help?" Avery looked at the bag, then at Daniel and me. She placed the handle in my hand. With her other hand, she took Daniel's. Then she stood between us as we walked out together. The consequences did not arrive all at once, and none of them looked like the dramatic punishment people expected after Avery's speech. Melissa and Grant were not dragged from the conference room, and no crowd waited outside to shame them. They simply left without the money, the ownership credit, or the daughter they had assumed would remain available whenever they decided to claim her. Maya referred the altered blueprint, the copied notary stamp, and the edited court evidence to the appropriate authorities. The process moved slowly, measured in interviews, document requests, and formal notices rather than public spectacle. Melissa and Grant's attorneys stopped contacting the buyer once they understood that every new argument created another record of what they had done. Melissa's professional life weakened first. Her work depended on convincing clients that she understood family trust, public image, and moral responsibility. Several clients ended their contracts after learning that she had hidden the abandonment of her own child, while advising other families on reputation. She released a statement blaming misinformation, but the full courthouse video and settlement demand had made that defense impossible to sustain. Grant's employer suspended him while reviewing whether he had used company equipment or financial accounts while preparing the false claim. His professional license was also placed under examination. He wrote to Avery twice, insisting that the legal dispute had become larger than he intended, but he still described himself as a father who had made mistakes, rather than a man who had tried to purchase the title back with her own money. Their new families could no longer remain outside the truth. Richard learned that Melissa had left Avery partly because she believed bringing a child into their marriage would threaten the life they were building. Celeste discovered that Grant had spent years telling people she refused to accept Avery, even though he had never seriously asked her to help create a home for his daughter. Their younger children began asking why Avery had been excluded from family photographs, and why their parents had waited until she became successful before trying to see her again. I felt no satisfaction imagining those conversations. The children in those homes had not created the lies, and I did not want Avery's justice to require another child's humiliation. Melissa and Grant had chosen their actions. The questions waiting for them at home were consequences of those choices, not weapons we needed to sharpen. Avery blocked both of their numbers and instructed Maya that all necessary communication had to pass through counsel. She did not announce that she would never forgive them. She only said she would not discuss forgiveness while they were still avoiding responsibility. "Maybe I will feel differently one day," she told me. "But that day belongs to me. They do not get to schedule it because they are uncomfortable." The acquisition continued with revised protections. The buyer confirmed that Avery's shares would remain under independent management until she reached the required age, and no one could use her personal story without written permission. Avery also requested that part of her proceeds establish a fund for children being raised by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and unrelated guardians who needed legal help, school support, or emergency care. The fund was her choice. I did not suggest the amount, control the accounts, or accept a title that implied I had created one bag. Reporters sometimes called me the woman behind the app, but I corrected them whenever I could. Avery had created the product with her team. I had created pickup cards for one frightened child because she needed to know someone was coming. For several months, I continued working at the library. Nothing about the money made me want to abandon the place where Avery had first drawn one bag on borrowed paper. I finished the projects I had started, trained another operations manager, and waited until leaving. Felt like my decision rather than a reaction to public attention. When I finally resigned, I did it because I wanted time to help with the kinship care fund and discover what my own life might look like when every hour was no longer organized around survival. Daniel remained close, without treating the crisis as an opportunity. He never spoke to reporters about us, never used Avery's success to promote his repair shop, and never stepped into conversations that belonged to Avery and me. When I needed help moving archived one-bag materials into a small office, he carried boxes. When Avery needed silence, he gave it to her. When I was ready to talk, he listened without trying to turn my pain into a reason I owed him closeness. 6 months after the conference room meeting, he and I sat outside the library after the final STEM session of the year. The parking lot lights had come on, and through the glass doors I could see Avery helping 2 younger students test a pickup alert. I told Daniel what I had been afraid to say. People have spent years telling me that loving Avery made my life smaller. Sometimes I worry that starting something new now would prove they were right, as though I had been waiting to be free of raising her. He watched Avery through the window before answering. I never thought loving her made your life smaller. It was the first thing that showed me how large your heart was. I wanted to believe him, but another fear remained. Avery had spent her childhood learning that adults could build new relationships and decide she no longer fit inside them. I could not ask her to trust that Daniel would be different merely because I wanted him to be. That evening, I found her in the one-bag office, placing the blue backpack inside a glass front cabinet. She had chosen not to display the court documents or the settlement demand beside it. The only card beneath the bag explained that one bag began with a child who needed to know who would come back for her. "I need to ask you something," I said. "How would you feel if Daniel became a larger part of my life?" Avery closed the cabinet and turned toward me. "Do you want him to?" "Yes, but I do not want you to feel that someone is taking your place." Her expression softened with a sadness that belonged to the child she had been and the young woman she had become. "You spent 10 years proving I deserved a family. You do not have to spend the rest of your life proving you can live without one." We did not rush anything after that. Daniel and I took walks, shared dinners, and allowed trust to grow without pretending that one honest conversation could guarantee a future. Avery watched what he did more closely than what he promised, and Daniel understood why. One Friday evening, he came to our house, carrying a loaf of bread and a repaired lamp from the one-bag office. I was setting the old kitchen table when Avery entered with her phone in her hand. "I updated the testing account," she said. She placed the screen beside my plate. The one-bag profile showed Mom as Joanne Keller, Safe Person as Daniel Mercer, and Home is here. Beneath the list, a notification appeared saying, "Your safe people are already with you." Daniel read it, then looked at Avery. "Am I approved for pickup or only emergency lamp repair?" "You are on probation," she said, but she was smiling. I turned toward the table and stopped. 3 plates waited beneath the warm kitchen light. For years I had believed protecting Avery meant holding the door closed against anyone who might ask me to choose. Now I understood that a safe home was not measured only by who was kept out. It was also measured by whether the people invited inside understood that love did not require anyone else to disappear. The blue backpack remained in the one-bag office, no longer hidden behind winter clothes. It marked the place where one child had been rejected, but it also marked the moment she had been chosen. Melissa had once promised to find Avery another family. She never did. She simply walked away long enough for us to become one.